Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Monday, April 20th, 2026. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
Social commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And joining us today, Christine's colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, director of its Critical Threats Project, and a person seriously involved with the Institute for the Study of War, whose work you can read on the wars in Ukraine and Iran and other hotspots around the world, understandingwar.org. Fred Kagan. Hi, Fred. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Hi, John. It's great to see you.
So, Fred, I don't know what we're going to talk about because it's not like there isn't anything going on, but you and your friends at the Critical Threats Project and Institute for the Study of War have identified over the course of the weekend, it appears, a pretty significant shift in how we need to understand the Iranian regime's approach to whatever it is that is going on this week, and that there seems to have been a power struggle, and that the power struggle, which is between bad guys and bad guys. I don't want to say that it's between good guys who want to negotiate with us and bad guys who are just mean. There's no good actors here, but that it appears that we have some perspective now on what is going on in this incredibly confusing morass of who's closing what, where, and why, and who's firing on who and why and where. Can you maybe lay that out for us as we understand it this Monday morning as we're speaking?
Sure. Well, I can try. The regime is opaque as always, and the U.S.-Israeli air campaign has generated a lot of upward mobility in the ranks of the government there, which makes it harder to understand exactly what's going on. But fundamentally, we seem to have two power centers that matter in Iran right now. One is Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who was tasked by the late Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei to oversee the war effort and the government fundamentally. Although, of course, not being a cleric, he was not really a candidate to succeed as Supreme Leader. And the U.S. has been interacting with Ghalibaf hitherto as if he were in charge effectively, which is sort of what the regime has tried to put out more or less. And of course he's the one who's sitting across the table, from our negotiators, taking positions. The thing is that Ghalibaf has no actual official executive position. He's just the parliament speaker. And so his influence comes from what Ali Khamenei said he should be doing, not from any actual real power block within the regime that matters against the other major power center, which is Ahmad Vahidi, the commander of the IRGC. And what Vahidi's an interesting character. He was the guy who established the Quds Force, and he has been a major power player within the IRGC sort of commanderate, those IRGC members who have stayed in and around the fighting forces and have a lot of wasta with the guys with guns. And Vahidi clearly does. And what we've seen over the past 48, 72 hours is that it's really clear that Vahidi is actually calling the shots and Ghalibaf is not. And I can go into the nerdly details about why we've assessed that. But that's very important because, among other things, it means that U.S. negotiators are not actually talking to the decision maker. They're talking to somebody who is supposedly in a position to make decisions but clearly isn't. And they're talking to someone in Ghalibaf who ostensibly is and probably is more pragmatic and more interested in making a deal. But it seems pretty clear that Vahidi is willing and able to veto concessions that Golubov makes, and so that's the basic situation. But it means that the negotiations are somewhat fraught here for these various reasons.
I mean, we were told when Vance left the room, whenever that was last week, a week ago, right? That they did not believe that the people who were across the table from them then had the capacity or the power to negotiate on anything, and that therefore the 21 hours of negotiations they had done were fruitless in the sense that their interlocutors could not move off the positions that they had established without communications from Tehran, and they weren't getting them or weren't being given any room to maneuver. So this weekend, then, Golubov or whoever announces that the straits are open, and then essentially Vahidi or his people issue a contradictory tweet statement saying, no, they're not, and you shouldn't have tweeted this, and what the hell is wrong with you, and then proceeded to fire on a couple of ships to suggest that the strait was now closed. They had announced that it was closed. So Trump, having announced that the strait was open on Friday, the strait is now closed, I believe. So
can I ask?
We are to take it that Vahidi has the reins simply by shooting change the facts on the ground, right? Iran had really only threatened shipping, and now we actually had an actual attack on shipping, even if it was really a little symbolic. It wasn't actually like they didn't blow up another ship. They just fired on a couple of ships. Do I have that right?
Yeah, yes. So it was Aragchi, the foreign minister, who tweeted that the strait was open, and then Trump amplified Aragchi's tweet, whereupon the world sort of fell in on Aragchi from a whole lot of IRGC outlets that started hammering him for doing that. And as you say, the Guard and notably the Supreme National Security Council stated that Aragchi was wrong and that was not the deal. I need to parse that just a minute, because by the Supreme National Security Council issuing a statement, what we mean most likely is the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council issuing a statement, and that is a guy named Zolgadar, who is one of Vahidi's guys. He is a longtime IRGC command personality, and he is the one that Vahidi insisted on participating in the negotiations over the objections of Golubov, we're told by various Iranian insiders. And that's noteworthy because we have further insider reporting that as the talks were going on and Golubov started to discuss the nuclear program, which apparently he was not authorized to do, Zolgadar started calling back to Tehran, presumably to Vahidi, and telling him that Golubov was going off script, which reportedly led to someone in Tehran ordering the Iranian delegation to leave Islamabad. There's some contradictory or possibly contradictory stuff here. It's not clear to us what the sequence was between Vance deciding to leave and the Iranian delegation being ordered out. But what we do have a consistent pattern of here is that Golubov and Aragchi can say what they want, but they can't decide what they want. And if what they're saying goes against what Vahidi and the people around him and people in that network want, then they're going to be overruled.
Abe?
And I want to ask a question that, just in terms of table setting, that it may be absurd at this point and risk complicating the picture further, but I have to ask, where at this point is I don't even want to say, the office of the Supreme Leader in all of this?
No, look, this is the dog that's not barking. The person who does not seem to be playing any prominent role in this is Mojtaba Khamenei, the Supreme Leader. That doesn't fundamentally surprise me. Mojtaba does not have anything like the wasta that his father had for many, many reasons. He took power in a controversial selection process that was fundamentally, as far as we understand, driven by the IRGC, and his legitimacy would have been questionable anyway. He is badly wounded. We have various reports about how functional he actually is. But what seems to be very clear is that he's not playing the role that Ali Khamenei would have played in this circumstance. It's not the Islamic Republic has always had factions. It has always had strong power centers that don't agree with one another. Ali Khamenei tolerated that. He was okay with that. But he was the one who ruled at the end of the day on who wins and who loses, and he would come in and adjudicate these kinds of disputes. We're seeing no evidence at all that Mojtaba is actually doing that right now. So when Vahidi and Ghalibaf have at it, we're not hearing indications that Mojtaba is saying you're right, you're wrong. Now, it's very possible that Mojtaba is with Vahidi and not with Ghalibaf. I don't want to dismiss the possibility that Vahidi is acting the way he is because Mojtaba is behind him. But Mojtaba just doesn't seem to be a significant player here. And that's important because, if you'll pardon a brief digression, people talk about Ghalibaf rightly as being, part of IRG, the larger IRGC community, because he was in the IRGC, that is the network that he's part of, and so on. We need to understand that the IRGC community consists of a number of different power blocks. And of those, sort of one way to break them up is there are those who have stayed, like Vahidi, in or near the uniformed ranks of the IRGC and have a lot of wasta, and in his case, actual command authority, over the guys with guns. And then there are people like Ghalibaf who left that milieu a long time ago and went into politics and went into business. They're still part of the larger Guard community, but it's a mistake to lump them all together and say this is all IRGC, because when push comes to shove, Vahidi is a major, massive figure in the history of the IRGC. Ghalibaf is not. Vahidi has the command authority over the guys with guns. Ghalibaf is the parliamentary speaker. Unless the supreme leader really comes down and says, Ghalibaf is the guy and he gets to do this stuff, and everybody actually honors the supreme leader's wishes, the guys with the guns are likely to win the arguments. And that's fundamentally what we're seeing going on here so far.
Okay, I've got two questions. One about, and they involve American strategy in relation to all of this. So, of course, the president is, I wouldn't say he's all over the map, but he was giving us very optimistic signals on Friday about how basically the war was all but coming to an end. The strait was going to be open. The ceasefire, our effort to close the strait as we were closing the strait was really biting, and that the rumors were that the Chinese were yelling at the Iranians about how this was really not helpful and they needed to stop doing this so that America could stop doing it. And then, of course, we got this reversal, Iranians firing on ships, and then the United States firing on a Iranian Chinese tanker. I don't quite understand.
It's an Iranian ship
it's an Iranian ship, but right.
But that has spent a lot of time going back and forth to China. But it was an Iranian ship.
It was an Iranian ship, so we fired on this Iranian ship after 6 hours, right?
After the ship violated our line, after the ship crossed the blockade line, we warned it and fired on it.
Yeah, for 6 hours we were warning them not to do it, and then they did it. Then we fired. So there has actually been an exchange of fire in the strait, on either side. So the ceasefire ends tomorrow. Wednesday, excuse me. Whatever this ceasefire is, it ends Wednesday. The president is now back to using very, very not as apocalyptic rhetoric as he was last week, but he's saying that's it. No bridges, no power plants. We are. It's going to be really unpleasant for you guys if you don't come
I
to the
believe he
table.
said no more Mr. Nice Guy.
No more Mr. Guy. And he said bridges and power plants. And the Iranians are saying we're not coming to Islamabad. And as at some point in the next couple of hours, if there's going to be a negotiation in Islamabad, J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner are going to have to get on a plane to fly the whatever it is, 16 hours to Islamabad to get there. So either they're going to get on that plane or they're not. So, Fred,
I thought they did.
have they left?
I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. Maybe they've left. They can always, like land in Doha and turn around. They can land and turn around. Okay, so let's say whatever. So here we are, and the American strategy, which has had these weird two faces in the last week, which is the ceasefire in the ceasefire and the closing opening of the strait, and then this ceasefire in Lebanon that is itself unbelievably complicated and already is a ceasefire without any firing ceasing, because there's been a lot of firing over the weekend between Israel and Lebanon, or Hezbollah, excuse me. How do you game out the strategy henceforth? By which I mean, we spent 6 weeks on an air campaign. There are now two other legs of warfare, right? There's warfare on the water and there's warfare on the ground. We've a teeny little taste of warfare on the seas. A couple of firings here and there. Obviously nothing on the ground. Does the United States have enough targets to continue with the air war approach? Or if we're moving into a second phase and the war is going to start again, aside from bombing, again, the bridges and power plants, if we do that, are we now not moving into a phase in which we really have to seriously consider using the seas and landing forces to get to a final resolution of this conflict?
Well, first of all, there are lots of targets left to shoot, including targets that we've shot at before. One of the unfortunate aspects of the ceasefire is that the Iranians have been digging out some of the facilities that we had buried but not destroyed, that housed some of their missiles and their launchers. So I know there's been reporting in the media about how we were running out of targets. This is ridiculous. Iran is an enormous country. We have not destroyed the Iranian security forces. We have not destroyed the Iranian military. We've not destroyed the Iranian missile program. We've not destroyed the Iranian drone program. We've done tremendous damage to them. But there is a lot more damage that we could do. And so there's no lack of targets for the U.S. to shoot at. And in fact, the campaign was suspended before we had finished the final rounds of targets. So separate and apart from the question of whether we go after infrastructure like power plants and bridges, which also generate a lot of targets, there are a lot of military targets that I would expect us to continue or resume hitting, that would continue to degrade the Islamic Republic's capability over the long term, which has been a big part of what the campaign is about. So there's no lack of targets for an air campaign. Do we need to land? Do we need to get on land? The question is always, in order to what? What would the mission be? Certainly, Trump is not invading Iran, a la 2003 to overthrow the regime, and I would never advocate such a thing. We don't have a large enough force in our entire military to do that. So that's that's not something that's being considered. Trump has talked about seizing Karg Island, the Iranian export hub. That would be an interesting thing to do. I'm sure the U.S. military can do it. Would incur some casualties, would incur some risk. I think it's important to note that doing that is very different from invading Iran, toppling the government, and taking control of it. That is, if we land on Karg Island, we can leave Karg Island. That's not one of these things that pins us irretrievably into permanent presence there. The point of doing that would be to make it more straightforward for us just to block Iranian oil exports without having to engage in a full-scale blockade. Given that we are imposing a blockade, I don't know that we need to seize Karg. But it would put pressure on the Iranians. So I think that if we just step back for a minute and say, what are the most important things that we need to accomplish here? Because I'm not sure. Look, it is very hard if you're fighting an air campaign fundamentally to have a decisive way to bring it to an end. I've been saying that for decades. That's it's an inherent problem, but we don't have a lot of options here if we're going to fight Iran. So that's what we're doing. The most important thing from my perspective now is to demonstrate to Iran and the world that Iran cannot close the strait at will, and that we can reopen the strait. And if the ceasefire breaks down without an agreement by the Iranians fully to reopen the strait with no conditions and no toll booths and no claims of Iranian control over who can go through it, then I would hope and trust that CENTCOM will focus its efforts on reopening the strait, demonstrating that we can do that, and depriving Iran of that threat and that deterrent, because it's very important for the global environment as well. We need to establish that we will not permit, and we can choose not to permit, anyone just to close critical waterways and hold the world and us hostage. So I would expect that to be a priority, and I think that that's a feasible undertaking. Although it will be challenging and it will require a lot of complex effort. Beyond that, we can continue to do a huge amount of damage to the Iranian missile program and drone program, not just blowing up missiles and drones, but also continuing the effort that we've been engaged in to blow up the factories that produce every component of that system to make it very hard for the Iranians to reconstitute. That's something that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but it's been a major focus of the air campaign. So, the issue is, at the end of the day, the enemy gets a vote, and the Iranians will have to decide how much pain they're willing to take in return for how much benefit. But if we can get traffic moving through the strait again, then the balance of pain is going to start to fall very heavily on Iran and very much more lightly on us. And that would be, your best bet for a calculus that the Iranians may be taken off ramp at some point.
Do you think that would be, would it be possible for Trump to sell that as a victory for the United States if the strait is open, there's some sort of agreement negotiated, but the nuclear material is once again still in the hands of devastated Iran? But we've had the 20-year option presented by Trump, and then he said 10 years. And one of the clear goals of this war was to make sure they were not able to have a nuclear weapon. Can you see now, with the change in how this has gone on, a possibility where that remains, some nuclear material remains in Iran's hands?
I can certainly see a possibility where President Trump decides to do that, but he's giving every indication that the nuclear program is his priority. So I'm not seeing any indication that he's going to be very enthusiastic about accepting a bad outcome on that. But that's, reopening the strait and getting the nuclear material out of there is going to require imposing a very fundamental defeat on Iran, and either just getting the material ourselves, which people have been talking about, which is a very tricky military operation, but probably feasible, or coercing the Iranians into giving it up.
Is there a verification regime that the Iranians would agree to that we should also agree to? Like, is there the possibility even of a deal that the Iranians would agree to the kind of verification that they didn't have to agree to in the last nuclear deal, and probably think they don't ever have to agree to, that they can pull one over on us?
I mean, I don't think anybody should be very sanguine about leaving a lot of enriched uranium in the hands of this regime. And I'm skeptical about the long-term effectiveness of verification regimes. We've seen that movie quite a number of times. So it's, I'm hedging, and I'm not clear, because at the end of the day, President Trump needs to decide what price he's prepared to pay for pressing for what kind of outcome, and what risks he's prepared to run. And I could see an outcome in which he decides that he's done enough damage, and we can impose a regime on them that will last for a while. I could see him doing that. I think it's suboptimal, but again, it depends. He's the only one who can, at the end of the day, can decide what price he's prepared to pay and what risks he's prepared to run to achieve what kind of outcomes.
I'm wondering, based on your extensive knowledge of military history, about the thing that I was optimistic about last weekend, or particularly with Trump's optimistic tweeting on Friday, what seemed to me to be very optimistic tone that he was taking, that had this astoundingly devastating air campaign against Iran, and we know that their internal communications are very much compromised, and we don't know how well the government itself is communicating with each other in different places in the country. And as you say, it's a very large country, so if you disrupt communication, somebody in Tehran may have no idea what's going on in Qom, or what is going on Karg Island, or something like that. They may not actually be able to get the information, and that the ceasefire meant that the bombs stopped falling, and that they came out of wherever it was that they were hiding. And this was my optimistic, or my hope, or whatever, that they came out and they looked and they said, oh my God, we are ruined. We are ruined. We are not going to be able to, we are 20 years set back in time. And in whatever way we can, in the most saving possible fashion, we need to wave the white flag, because 3 more weeks of this and we are bombed back to the Stone Age. Now, clearly the IRGC, Vahidi and all that are not willing to say that. I am wondering whether that is partly what Aragchi and Ghalibaf and all that were thinking or doing. Is that me just like, that's hopium, it's not real? Or do you think that is that something? It does seem to be something that happens in war, that nations' wills are broken after an overwhelming assault leaves them tattered and looking at what the aftermath is.
I don't think their will is broken. This is an ideological regime, and the guys who are in charge are the guys who fought in the Iran-Iraq War. And they fought with the Guard in the Iran-Iraq War. And one of the things that happened over the course of the war.
So that's that was the 8-year war that cost at least 1 million Iranian lives.
Right. And as that war,
89, yeah.
And as that war came toward its close, things were not going well for the Iranians, and ultimately Ayatollah Khomeini drank from the bitter chalice, as he said, drank from the poison chalice, as he said, and wound up the war. But over the objections of the IRGC, including guys like Vahidi, who, as that war progressed, just became more sort of apocalyptic in their embrace of, sacrifice to achieve the goal. Now, it's been a long time since then. These guys have gotten a lot more comfortable. They have made a lot of money, and they have, things were much more comfortable for them. But at the core, it's the same generation that's still running the place, that's been running it all along. And these guys, it's very hard to break the will of these guys. We clearly haven't broken Vahidi's will. I don't think we've broken Golubov's will. I actually don't think this is an issue of Golubov. I mean, I don't want it's always hard to try to do this sort of long distance psychoanalysis, but I don't think that Golubov looked around and saw how wrecked they were and said, okay, we need to surrender. I actually think that Golubov saw something else, which is the real deterrent here seems to be our ability to show everybody that we can close the strait when we want to. And that's at least as effective, if not more, than a nuclear bomb would be. And by the way, we have this capability right now, and we've just demonstrated it, and we don't have a nuclear bomb. So maybe we give a bit on the nuclear program in order to preserve now and cement this idea that we control traffic through the strait, and therefore everybody's got to surrender to us. That seems to be the position that Golubov was sort of taking at the talks. And it sounds like it was Vahidi who was saying, no, we're not trading any of these things. And I could imagine, within the realm of people who are not entirely reasonable people in Iran disagreeing about the importance of the nuclear program at this point. Because, again, I can imagine Golubov saying, hey, we have the strait, we don't need the nuke. I can imagine Vahidi saying, yeah, but no one's ever attacked a country with a nuclear weapon. And they may try us on the strait again, so we really, we can't give that away. But at the end of the day, Vahidi seems to have won the argument. What I'm not seeing here is any of these guys saying or giving any indication that they think they need to throw in the towel, that they're desperate. On the contrary, I think they think that they're winning in a way. I think they think that there's more pressure on Trump than there is on them. They're willing to take pain. Again, these are people who took a huge amount of pain in the Iran-Iraq war and didn't want to end it. I think they're willing to take a lot of pain, and they think the pressure is on Trump. And they think they're winning and we're losing. And unfortunately, I would say our own media is generally helping that narrative by continually pumping out the narrative that we are losing and that we have lost and so on. And it's not accurate, and it's also not helpful.
Okay, so I know you got to.
Can I just ask a quick question? One more quick question about the strait, since we have you on here. This issue of is it open or is it closed? I know that's how we discuss it, but can't Iran actually exercise a lot of power geopolitically by just having the constant threat and risk of shutting it down? I mean, that will make it difficult to insure these tankers. It will make some people very wary of using the strait at all. I mean, is that, even if we can say we have it secure, that would then require a huge amount of effort on our part to escort ships and all that. Is that another possibility even if negotiations come to some sort of agreement on these other points?
I do need to go, but I want to answer this because it's a super important issue that you're raising, and it gets into a discussion that we all need to be having. The Iranians have not closed the strait in the sense that the Iranians have not made it impossible for ships to transit the strait. What the Iranians have done is attack ships and threatened to attack ships, and that's non-trivial. I'm not trivializing that, but the people who decide in that context whether the strait is open or closed is a combination of ship captains, ship owners, insurers, and countries of flag. Because those are the people who decide what their level of risk tolerance is for actually moving shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. And it's important to keep in mind that shipping companies, ship captains, and so on take risk all the time. They sail through waters where there are pirates around the Horn of Africa, through the Strait of Malacca. There are acceptable levels of risk in the shipping community that are generally agreed upon and tolerated. What I'm a little bit alarmed about is that we're not having a discussion, at least not in public, about what level of risk is acceptable and what defensive measures can be taken to reduce that risk. And instead, I think people have been fundamentally looking to President Trump to say, you need to get the risk to zero, otherwise traffic is not going to move. And that's not realistic, but it also isn't necessary according to the traditions of how these things work out. So I think that one of the things that needs to go on here is a larger conversation, and again, this may be happening just quietly, but a larger conversation among the private entities and many, many countries that are affected by this about what is the necessary level of risk that the U.S. and whoever will help us out need to get to before shipping can resume. And I think that is going to entail a combination of reducing the Iranian missile and drone capability, mining capability, and all of that stuff by offensive action. But I think it's also going to entail defensive measures. I think we're going to need to talk about putting counter-drone teams on ships that transit the strait while they transit the strait, in the same way that we put security teams on board ships that are transiting through pirate-infested waters. I think there's going to be there needs to be a coherent discussion with all of these parties about exactly what measures we're going to take, because the one outcome that I think is unlikely here is that we're going to get to a full agreement where everybody's happy and the Iranians just say, absolutely no problem, any ships you want to go. I don't think that we're going to get there. So I think we're really going to need to take this on, and that's going to require getting beyond, will Trump reopen the strait, or will the Iranians reopen the strait? And this is a discussion I think we really need to be having.
Fred, I know we have a million questions more, but you got to go, and I want to thank you so much. Remember, Critical Threats Project at AI and UnderstandingWar.org for daily updates on where we are strategically, tactically, militarily, and diplomatically on this war. And of course, very importantly, we haven't even been able to ask you about the amazing set of events that seem to be taking place in the war between Russia and Ukraine, which is the real fundament of UnderstandingWar.org's work, and has been over the past 4 years. So anyway, thank you so much. Remember to keep your browser open.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I talked about my optimism, and Fred being a healthy dose of skepticism about my optimism about how ruined Iran was, even in appearance to the Iranians, which I think gets to this question that I think was hinting at, which is how much of this controversy that is going on, again, involves us debating ourselves about this war rather than actual conversations about what's going on in the battlefield or in the global battlefield itself. I see these polls. NBC came out with a poll yesterday, said it's like 67% of the public opposes or is like unsatisfied with the way that we have handled the war in Iran, with Iran. There's something hinky about this, just for this reason. What, with the exception of gas prices going up $1, which is something that Americans have dealt with on and off over the last 40 years, there have been price spikes and things like that. And I know, so I'm not going to downplay it, but I'm not saying it's not like it's gone up $4, right? What pain, what imposition of sacrifice has there been on the American people at all in relation to this war? Maybe the fact that it is so distant and so much an abstraction to people means that they're viewing it like people who are sports fans calling up sports radio talk shows to say, well, if it were me, I wouldn't have sent that guy from second to third. I mean, that was really, what a dumb move that was. That there's no one in America has that much skin in this game somehow, and therefore are sort of like very haphazardly saying, oh no, it's not going well, not knowing anything about how it's going or feeling anything about it particularly.
I don't know. I mean, I think that is an apt description of the first few weeks of the conflict. But I do think now what has emerged is a palpable sense of discomfort with both the continued uncertainty, the radical ping-ponging between it's going to be over in a day or two, it's going to be over in a few weeks, and we're going to blow this, destroy this civilization and blow up all their bridges, and the apocalyptic rhetoric hasn't helped. And I was thinking over the weekend that this is the first time in my lifetime where it's the President of the United States making frequent apocalyptic statements rather than what I grew up with in the 80s, which is listening to Tehran, making frequent apocalyptic statements about what would happen to us. And I think there is a discomfort in the population about those two things, the kind of rhetoric coming out of this White House, and the uncertainty about where it's going, and the fact that it still remains, again, an undeclared war. I mean, this is a conflict that we're involved in. It is dragging on. I think you're absolutely right, John, that gas prices tends to be a sort of alarm bell for a lot of other domestic issues that I think people feel this conflict is keeping the administration distracted from. The economy, most of all. Susie Wiles today in D.C. is gathering a bunch of leaders of the GOP to talk about strategy for the midterm elections. So I think the combination of all that leads to a sort of unease that I don't think we should mistake for not knowing what's going on or not following the conflict at a granular level like we do. I do get a sense that that's a problem. And again, it's not really anti-Trump. It's just, what are we doing in this? What are we doing? What is our position in the world? What is happening here? Why 1 week are we going to bomb a civilization into rubble, and another minute we're across a negotiating table with it? It's that confusion.
Right. Well, that's, the president's rhetoric. There's another side to the president's rhetoric affecting this, which is the declarations of total victory in last year's bombing campaign. There was the 12-day war set off by the American bombers, the capstone of which was American bombers bombing the Iranian nuclear installations. And Trump has been insisting that we obliterated their nuclear program, buried them, it's over, all this other stuff. And I think then having the rhetoric now that Christine talks about is really jarring for people. I think people are like, well, did we bury the nuclear program? Did we destroy the nuclear program? Because if we did, then what are we doing there? And Trump says this is not about the Strait. This is about, first and foremost, the nuclear program. And people are going, I thought you said we blew that up a year ago. So I think that there's a certain amount of confusion in the sort of mood swings of the president himself.
Okay, let's go back 20 years, because I wrote this piece for the last issue, current issue, up at commentary.org. Our May issue, fantastic issue. We'll talk more about it. But in our April issue, so I have this piece called "They Should Have Listened to My Dad." And why did I say that? Because my father wrote an article for Commentary in 2007 called "The Case for Bombing Iran." And what was the case for bombing Iran? It was they are making noises about wanting to get a nuclear weapon. We know where they are building their nascent sites. We had 3 possible sites at the time. Israel had created the precedent of bombing nascent nuclear programs, right? One in Syria, one in Iraq, 25 years apart in time. And that what we needed to do was make it clear to the Iranians we would never allow them to get a nuclear weapon by bombing their sites then, right? And George W. Bush didn't listen, and he didn't do it. And then Obama made the JCPOA deal as the 7 years between my father's article and the JCPOA allowed them to build, to develop centrifuge technology and do some stuff, even though their nuclear scientists were already getting killed by the Israelis in order to set the program back. I bring this up only because what we're dealing with here is this question of what enriched uranium they already have. And it's not like going back and saying we should have done this 20 years ago is fruitless, right? Because the past is the past and it cannot be changed. But you see the complication of the mission, the 12-day war, and where we are now, which is we bombed their sites to cripple their program or destroy. We said their program is destroyed. Then they tell us that, it's buried way deep, but we have like 800 pounds of nuclear material that that are still here in Iran, buried under rubble. At some point, we'll be able to tunnel and get it out. So, which is why Fred brought up earlier this question of whether or not one mission that might conclude this war is the United States going and going and getting the nuclear materials out of Isfahan which would mean setting up a base, bringing in diggers, and getting the stuff out of the ground in an enemy country, which seems like pretty crazy, right?
Top Gun 3 plot, though.
Right, literally, right. But because you can't bomb a nuclear program per se. I mean, you can bomb its components, and you can bomb the factories, and you can destroy what they have, the machinery. But once they have fissile material, and you either got to get it out of there, or you got to change the regime to a regime that will give you the materials and let it get out of there, the way Ukraine actually surrendered its nuclear materials in 1994. And I don't see, we're back to this question of whether or not ultimately the only way this war is going to be won is with regime change. The regime that Fred describes here is a regime that will never surrender and that is battle hardened after the most ruinous war, one of the most ruinous wars, regional wars of the 20th century. And they lost it and they won it. They're still here, so in that sense, they won it, right? They're if it's the same guys who were fighting it in 1989 who were running the country in 2026, they didn't lose the war against Iraq. So what choice? Either we so cripple them that we can literally land at Isfahan, dig that tunnel, get the stuff out, and fly out inside a country still run by the IRGC and the mullahs, or they have to fall. I don't really understand what other choice there is here. And again, though I've been a cheerleader for the war myself, been pretty much saying this since the beginning, right, Abe? I don't think we haven't, like, the idea that regime changes, Trump has never said that was what the war was for. But if your war aims are the war aims that you have, including the one that's, Christine, that you were like laying out, which is the strait has to be open, not sure how that's going to be feasible without them being out of power.
Or, something that Fred seemed to allude to, which is that we beat the regime down so much that it can be coerced into handing over the materials, which, John, as we've discussed in the past, is almost like regime change. I mean, it's not the same regime once you. I mean, it may physically be the same regime, but we're not dealing with the same threat when we're now talking about a regime that we've gotten to willingly hand over its nuclear materials. I also think that part of the story here about why Americans have been increasingly down on this war. I hate to do this, but it's unavoidable. The media has furnished the American public with so many negative narratives throughout this. They've told Americans exactly what they're supposed to think about this far off war if they're not feeling it, aside from gas prices, which as you said aren't negligible. They've told them that this is ruined, that we've ruined American credibility with an illegal war. We've sacrificed our relationships with important allies. We've created a worse regime than the one that was there beforehand. We're forever about to commit war crimes. Donald Trump got conned into this by Israel, was sold a bill of goods, and now Trump's in a trap. All Iran has to do to win is survive, and that's a win for them. And then when Fred talks about how there must be elements in the regime now thinking, well, this threat on the Strait of Hormuz, that's even more valuable than a nuclear weapon. I was thinking, this is like what Western and American experts have been telling them. Like, this is the story that the West has been furnishing the regime with for weeks, ever since the first rumblings about the Strait, saying, Iran knows now. Iran found something better than a nuclear weapon. They've found that they can close the Strait of Hormuz.
That's his like not to sorry to interrupt, but it just I was caught by something that Jake Sullivan said, so I just want to bring that to Abe's point. Jake Sullivan, the former national security advisor for Joe Biden, was on Bill Maher's show, and he said, and he said that. Now, so Jake Sullivan, the last president's national security advisor, so we're not finding some lunatic anonymous Twitter account who's saying this stuff. We're talking about the people who make policy when Democrats are president. And the guy who makes these types of policy when Democrats are president just did exactly what Abe just said, which is, the Iranians have realized they've gotten something, he said, more valuable out of this than they had before, which is that they now realize that they can close the strait. Before it's only been theoretical in the past. But now they realize they can do it and they can get what they want from it. And I couldn't agree more with Abe's point about all this, because this talking point seems to me insane. Right? I mean, am I getting overly worked up about this, or because it seems like the idea that Iran just discovered that they can control the flow of traffic through the strait is obviously false. And what's really happened is that some American Western policymakers have just realized, and they weren't really paying attention.
Well, okay, that's
the idea that Iran has this in the,
right.
Iran didn't realize that its control over the strait meant it controlled the strait. It feels ridiculous to me.
Well, it's ridiculous because they closed the strait in 1987, and we had to go to war. We had a small naval war with Iran reopening the strait. We, the United States. So actually, not only did they not just discover it, they tried it before. They did it before. And just as Fred says, it's the same people who are in power now who did it then. So do they remember it? Yes, they remember it. And they haven't done it. And the one thing about this line that I think you're right to say that it's insane is this can go on for a while, stuff like that. But we're not that affected by the closing of the Strait. We, the United States, are not that affected by the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. Much of the rest of the world is profoundly affected by if free transit through the Strait of Hormuz is threatened. And basically, the world cannot allow this to happen. China can't allow it to happen. Europe can't allow it to happen. We can kind of allow it to happen. I mean, that is maybe we can't because we sort of started this, this boulder rolling down a hill. So it's sort of up to us to see if we can stop it, because we're, the pre-current, what you call it, sort of like chaos. There was some status quo in which the Strait of Hormuz was open, and so we upset the apple cart. However, simple fact of the matter is, Iran is playing with a very large fire here in declaring economic war on the rest of the planet, on the rest of the sort of developed world that needs everything coming out of the Persian Gulf, needs the oil coming out of the Persian Gulf to do its business. So, that's one thing that's sort of missing from this conversation, which is they can't close the Strait of Hormuz at will. I mean, it's like in a game of diplomacy, like if you play the game diplomacy, which is a lot of our nerdy people's, this was our introduction to how statecraft works. If you make alliances with people and then you screw them in the game, if you're Turkey and you make an alliance with Russia and then you play and you do something with France that's against Russia, then all the other people who are playing they have to kill you off because you cannot be trusted to make a deal. That's what it's sort of lesson 101. If Iran decides that the way for it to stay in power and try to beat the United States is to focus solely on its power over the Strait of Hormuz, that cannot stand. And it's not just us, I think, that will be the parties that make it not stand. That's why I focus on the nuclear materials here in relation to us. That's what Trump has said is the American red line. They cannot have a nuclear weapon, and we want that material. And he has now defined that as the war-winning or war-losing red line. He hasn't defined the Hormuz as the war-winning or war-losing red line.
Right, but I think that's right, and I think that's why I was pressing Fred on that, because I would like to hear more. I would like to hear that reiterated again and again by this administration, so that the American people know that that's also the red line. I will say with the Strait, though, they have, especially if it's the IRGC guys calling the shots right now, they have every incentive to have this, sort of denial architecture, I guess is what the strategists call it, where they have lots of little ways to just make it difficult to get through the Strait. And those are working. So they can effectively have that power. And for them, that moves them on the chessboard into a position of greater power geopolitically. And then China is watching all of this. China is watching how the United States deals with a tiny choke point in geopolitical adversaries like Iran, and thinking about that one foundry in Taiwan that makes most of the chips that power almost everything on the planet. And what will we do if that's seized by the CCP? So I think that those bigger questions are important, but we will start to feel the effects of the Strait being closed. Our farmers are already paying a lot more for fertilizer, which will drive up food costs, and we're going to see the oil futures right now are very optimistic, but that will not be sustainable for more than a few weeks, at least from some of the strategists I've read in terms of economic effects. Asia is definitely hitting it. We are seeing airlines starting to cut down on flights because jet fuel is becoming more expensive. So I think the global economy means we will start to feel it eventually, but you're right that we're not feeling it the same way a lot of Asian countries in particular are. But that to me that should be a domestic political concern for this administration as well.
Part of the issue here, which with Abe's laying out what the media are up to, the media and the foreign policy establishment, all this is, they are trying to lay the predicate for an American defeat. By which I mean that by defining an American victory as being something that is unachievable, as Fred would say, that is, say, zero risk in shipping. When we all saw Captain Phillips, we know what the Somali pirates did for like 3 or 4 years until essentially in a quiet way the U.S. Navy killed all of them. People don't really understand this, but we went to essentially to the Barbary Coast or whatever constitutes the Barbary Coast now and wiped out the piracy. If the point here is zero risk, then we lose. And these are people who don't want this war to be won in the sense that, A, they don't want to give Trump a victory, but B, they do not want to establish the precedent that martial means are the way to solve these kinds of disputes. Ideologically, emotionally, even you might say morally, they do not believe in the use of hard power. They don't like hard power. They think it's self-defeating. They think it's monstrous. They think that war itself is a war crime. And they would like to establish the precept that here the United States went and did this again and again. It's shown itself to be a monstrous way of doing things, and we'll never do it that way again. They didn't get together and have a meeting and discuss and make this the purpose of how this is covered and discussed. But it is the moral architecture or the sort of theoretical architecture behind the skepticism of the war, the negativity about the war, the utter dismissal of the tactical victory that is the air campaign that was waged by the United States until the ceasefire and Israel. And so there is a real battle going on for the hearts and minds of the American people in the West, the loss of which will have very long-lasting ramifications exactly because what lesson will China take? China's lesson will be, we can take Taiwan. I mean, when China will take Taiwan, we don't know. Whether China will need to take, or Taiwan will be like, well, we're never going to get defended if they try to take Taiwan. We better make the best deal we can with China. Or China will start by taking Taiwan by wiping out that rare earth, the chip factory, the TSMC chip factory, TMSC, whatever the initials are, in Taiwan. So the stakes here are very high, and I think for the American people, though, the stakes are weirdly low. That's where I started this post-Fred conversation. I don't think the American people understand how high the stakes are and why they should support the war, because you don't want to lose it once you start it, even if you're against it. But of course, that's not the way a lot of people feel, because they think that war itself should not be allowed to happen. More people than used to feel that way, I would say. And let me take this moment, not that I want to monologize here, but I want to make a commentary recommends that is related to this question of war and peace, and also a little bit of personal anecdotes. Saturday was my 65th birthday, and my family took me to see the musical 1776 at the Paper Mill Playhouse in Millburn, New Jersey. The Paper Mill is it's about 45 minutes outside of Manhattan. It's been there for 80 years, 90 years. It is one of the best regional theaters in America. Various shows, including Newsies and others, originated at the Paper Mill, and they do a lot of revivals. And they revived 1776, which is emotionally important to me because that's the first Broadway show that I ever saw in the year 1969 when I was 8 years old. So here I am, 60, whatever it was, 58 years later or something, going to see this revival. I've seen various revivals over the years and seen the movie and all this. 1776 is a very unusual show. It is a musical about the writing of the Declaration of Independence. It begins 2 months before July 4th, 1776. It is set in the Continental Congress, and the main characters are John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, along with their great rivals, John Dickinson of Pennsylvania and Edward Rutledge of North Carolina. And the idea in the show is John Adams is a obnoxious and disliked and annoying dyspeptic person who is pushing for independence, and he finally bullies the Congress into creating a committee to write the Declaration of Independence. And it's an unusual show because that's what it's about. We now know because of Hamilton that you can do a show about, the founding fathers. That would be a huge success. But 1776 was the template. It ran for 3 or 4 years. It won a Tony. And it's extraordinarily unusual because it features, it's got like 8 musical numbers, very few musical numbers for a full musical. And it features 2 very long scenes without songs. First, the debate over whether to establish the committee that will write the Declaration, and then a debate over what is in the Declaration, and how to edit the Declaration to make it acceptable to everybody, which concludes with the moment at which they have to decide whether to remove the passage saying that slavery is an evil and must be expunged. And the fight is between North Carolina, which says this is our peculiar institution. That's actually anachronistic because that term came in 40 or 50 years later into the American discourse. But we're not signing this if you say that slavery must be outlawed. And John Adams, obviously an abolitionist, and John Hancock, an abolitionist who was obviously the head of the Congress and all that. The question is then put to them: Are you gonna eliminate this, or are you gonna keep it in? And the fight that takes place in the course of the show is: do you have to do the lesser evil in order to get to the greater good? And as Franklin tells Adams in the concluding passages, we have to get this country created. We are doing something here that has never been done before. We have to get this country created, and we are going to have to make this compromise and deal with the consequences later, and let history be our judge as to whether or not we did the right or wrong thing. But what needs to happen here is that this country needs to be incepted into being. And the show concludes with the signing of the Declaration. It is an emotionally overwhelming experience for me personally because of my 50 some odd year history with the show and what it has meant to me and my own taste and culture and all of that. But particularly now, here we are 2.5 months before the 250th celebration of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And as the director said in a note, he turned to his 22-year-old daughter and said, I lived through the the bicentennial, and I remember feeling this surge of pride, but now it feels like people don't feel that pride about being an American anymore. And his daughter said, I don't feel pride. I don't feel any pride about being an American. And why is that? It gets to Christine saying what Trump needs to do to sell the war. For the last 50 years, nobody has told young Americans the story of the United States, that warts and all, something was created here that had never existed before, a nation conceived in liberty, conceived in the idea of personal and individual liberty, that created the most successful society the world has ever known, flaws and all. So the show goes into the flaws and does not question that there were flaws and that there was evil and that something evil was agreed to and all of that. And with all, and just in spite of all, it is still the greatest accomplishment, political accomplishment of man, and the greatest political change that the world has ever seen. And we remain that today. If you are in the ambit of my voice and you can get to Millburn, New Jersey, go to the Paper Mill Playhouse's website, get yourself a ticket, go see this beautifully staged, unbelievably powerful affirmation of the American Republic and America's purpose and its ideals. It's also got great songs, great dancing, great acting. And again, this very, very sophisticated, by the book's author, Peter Stone, otherwise known more as a farceur than a serious person, manages in a very unusual setting to lay out the fight over this first principle question, over whether or not, if you cannot get rid of slavery as you are creating the United States, whether it was worth creating the United States at all. That answer seems to me to be unrecognized. I mean, that there is no question. But of course, we are living through a time in which that question is the question that has caused the poisoning of our civic culture by the idea that we do not praise our founding. We do not praise our political system for creating the conditions at the very origin that would allow for its emendation and change, evolution, and move toward greater and greater and greater freedom. And here we are, the freest people in the world, and we do not recognize it. We do not accept it. We teach our children to crap on it. It's heartbreaking. And there needs to be a change here in the way we go about this, or we will hang, surely, as Benjamin Franklin says, if we do not hang together, we will all hang separately. So that's 1776 at the Paper Mill Playhouse in Millburn, New Jersey. Go see it. You can also rent the movie or see the movie. I think it might be on Prime or on HBO Max. Movie is a completely faithful and quite wooden adaptation of the stage show with everybody who was in the original cast. So it's not the greatest movie, but it is the show in whole. So you can also watch that. Anyway, thanks so much to Fred Kagan for his depressing and enlightening briefing. And we'll be back tomorrow. So for Seth, Abe, and Christine, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.